The most recent National Signing Day, very quiet in Gainesville, but little else is quiet on the Gator home front concerning football news. That's why we've got Jackie Franchuli on the line from allgators.com on SI. Jackie, how you doing today?
I'm great. I slept in on a National Signing Day, Mark. That hasn't happened since I started covering high school recruiting.
I didn't. I lined up about 12 to 14 guests, but much like you, they typically had just the one item. Like, we got one guy, but it's just become a different deal in the last 4 years. That's all there is to it. National Signing Day is officially now, I believe, in December. I don't think there's any question about that. Personnel news, though, doesn't stop with the transfer portal, with the early entries to the NFL draft. DeMarcus Bowman gained so much attention when it was announced a few weeks ago that he was moving from Clemson as a five-star running back to Florida. Some other transfers that were just added to the roster here in the last maybe 48 hours. Dylan Meeks from Akron, Daquan Newkirk, Auburn, and Antonio Shelton from Penn State. So the significance of these additions.
Right. So first off, DeMarcus Bowman, how many times when I've been on your show, Mark, have I said that Florida needs to keep guys talented like DeMarcus Bowman in state in order to win those recruiting battles and in order to say they picked up another level of their recruiting? And here we are. They picked him on the transfer portal. And to be fair, Dan Mullen and his staff have done a great job adapting to the transfer portal. That is something that I think it was on your show I mentioned 2 years ago that they kind of reformed their recruiting office to include, someone who actually looks at the transfer portal and kind of evaluates talent there. And that's something that they really made an emphasis on, and something they've done well in. Obviously, these guys that they just picked up, including DeMarcus Bowman and those defensive linemen, are huge for this team. We can't really sugarcoat that they didn't have a great running game last year. Getting a talented guy like DeMarcus Bowman is obviously a very big asset. A guy from Lakeland, who is obviously, which is obviously a big area for really talented players to come out of. Florida wants to continue that pipeline with him, Keon Zipper. And obviously those D linemen that came in, that's fantastic news for them. If you look at Florida's rosters before those transfers were factored in, they were going to have a big struggle on the D-line as far as quality depth. They're very young at that position. Kyrie Campbell and TJ Slayton were leaving for the NFL. So they really needed to have some class balance in that position. And they're bringing these guys to kind of help with those holes for now. And that's something that Florida has utilized the transfer portal very well. Don't forget Van Jefferson, Trey Grimes. Those guys were transfer portal guys. Jonathan Grenard, another guy they brought in from a transfer portal. So Florida and Dan Mullen and his staff have really done well in the transfer portal. And they continue to do well. Just a few days ago, they were able to get five-star tight end Eric Gilbert into the fold as well. He's not going to enroll in the spring. The guys mentioned earlier are all enrolled in the spring. He's going to enroll in the summer. But that's another big get, especially when you're missing a guy like Kyle Pitts, who has gone to the NFL. Keon Zipper and Kamori Gamble have done well on occasions when they were asked to, but when you saw him, when Kyle Pitts didn't play against LSU and when he didn't play in the bowl game, you really saw where he was missed. Obviously, he's a mismatch nightmare, and you can't really fault guys like Zipper or Gamble to not play like Pitts. You can't do that. It's simply unfair. Now, by getting Eric Gilbert into the fold, now that's huge news for them because he's also a mismatch nightmare. So that is something that Florida can utilize. So I'm curious to see how he does on this new offense that will not have Kyle Trask under center. But that was another big pickup. The only thing that I still remain concerned when it comes to Florida is I don't think they're doing enough still on the actual recruiting trail, not related to the transfer portal. I know the transfer portal is still something that they're doing great in, and they're got to utilize just because the way the college football game is changing. With NCAA considering a 1-year waiver rule where you can transfer to any school the first time and you can play right away. I think it's going to change the game, but at the same time, you look at an Alabama and a Clemson, they don't rely on transfer portal guys in order to compete and to win and fill those holes. They might, if you look at Florida, they are relying on the transfer portal and they're doing well in it. But again, you have to look at the long-term effects of this. If you're a 5-star, 4-star recruit and and you're considering Florida in addition to an Alabama or a Clemson or even Ohio State, you're thinking, well, if I go to Florida, what's going to prevent them from getting a transfer portal guy in a year or two? And then I will suddenly move from thinking I'll be number one in the depth chart to number 2 or 3 simply by them going to the transfer portal and getting a guy who is more experienced or a veteran or like a 4th or 5th year senior. So that is something where now recruits are going to think about in the back of their mind when you deal with the transfer portal. So although I'm going to say it again, Dan Mullen and his staff have done an amazing job, but you now have to weigh the long term versus the short term here. So short term, great move. They're going to do great for next year. They knew they had holes to fill, but now they have to realize that you can't just put a Band-Aid on every single position. You got to look towards a long term gain. And you might, if you want to create a dynasty like Nick Saban, it's still going to the grassroots of high school talent.
I'm curious to see the Gilbert fit. He's a 5-star, so the talent replacement's almost an even match. But obviously, Kyle Pitts has proven to be one of the best, not just tight ends, receivers in the game. Eric Gilbert, though, did step on the field and was very productive in his freshman campaign there at LSU with 35 catches, 10 yards per catch, 3 touchdowns, with a revolving door at quarterback, a lot of youth, a lot of inexperience, and he was still able to put up some nice numbers. So for Florida to lose the immense talent of a Kyle Pitts and to be able to flip it around to get an Eric Gilbert, who from a talent standpoint, again, the ceiling is high, is immense right there, and could be a much less of a loss than many of us anticipated. Speaking of which, as we move on to the next level, the NFL draft, Kyle Pitts will be the sure first rounder coming from the Gators. There's a lot of speculation, though, and Kadarius Toney has certainly impressed many people. He was down at the Senior Bowl and stood out among Kyle Trask down there, Trayvon Grimes, Sean Davis. Your thoughts about Pitts and Toney in particular?
Yeah, sure. Now, obviously, Kyle Pitts was always going to be a guy that was going to be a first rounder. Like, no one is going to be shocked at that. He is a All-American. He is a great mismatch nightmare for any team. He's just a very talented player. So no one is going to be shocked that NFL teams are considering him to go in the first round. Now, if you had asked me maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, if Kadarius Toney would have been a first rounder, I probably would have said maybe if he were to develop a little bit more, because I still felt like he was one of those gadget players maybe like just 2 years ago, because he was just someone that didn't stick to the playbook, and that's great in one way and it's great in the other. I still remember Felipe Franks and Kyle Trask having to be forced to block for him because he went away from his blockers on a couple of plays, and sometimes he would run like 50 yards and gain like 2 or even lose 10. But that changed this past year. He really developed really well. He really learned how to be an all-around wide receiver. Billy Gonzalez did a great job of helping him develop, and Kadarius Toney did a great job of staying disciplined and kind of sticking with it. And he developed into a really good wide receiver. He was a huge weapon for Florida across the field for the Gators this year, also on special teams. And I think he's been very disciplined this past year. And I think NFL teams have noticed that change. And in the Senior Bowl, he did very, very well. So I think Kadarius Toney might sneak in the first round. I would be shocked if he drops too much in the NFL draft. I think he's definitely a player that could do very well in the NFL. And he has shown that he can learn. I think that's the biggest thing, is when you get a player like this, you've got to show that you have discipline. You got to show that you have an ability to be coached and develop. And I think that's what he did, which is why his stock was raised.
I'm a stats nerd, Jackie. So Kadarius Toney's 120 career receptions. I'm going to go scurrying after our conversation to the Florida record book, because that's got to rank extremely high. I got to think 4 full years, caught 70 balls this past year. And again, 120 for the career has to be top 5-ish, I would think.
Yeah, no, and look at those numbers that you just said. Most of those catches came in his last year. That's how much he developed into a great player towards the end of his career. And that's just the effort that he put in and the maturity and the discipline that he developed over the course of his Florida career.
Trayvon Grimes also had good reports coming out of the Senior Bowl week, and in particular during the game, he was 5th in receiving between the two teams among 20 wide receivers there. Sean Davis, I saw where he was working a little bit at cornerback, even though he was primarily a safety there at Florida. So some interesting prospects for the Gators there for the NFL draft coming up at the end of April.